Daphnes.
I'm August. I'm Carl.
And I'm Afi. Welcome to the Periphery. Today we are talking with one of my favorite professors I've had at Stanford, Professor Daphne Keller. She is director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center program on platform regulation. And today we are going to talk content moderation. But before we get there, hello, Professor Keller.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. Did you want to start just kind of giving a little bit of background about, what makes you kind of like the leading expert on these issues?
Well, I won't endorse that characterization, but
you can quote me on
so
that
I was a lawyer at Google for 10 years, including being the Associate General Counsel in charge of web search. And so I saw a lot of really interesting questions come up where governments wanted Google to take down content or people other than governments did, and dealt with laws all over the world that affected that. And I moved to Stanford in 2015 to work on those same set of laws. And it's really, it's not the laws about what speech is prohibited, which really varies from country to country. It's the laws about if you're going to outsource to private companies the job of policing that speech, how do you do that? Like, what's the mechanism that avoids bad unintended consequences?
I think maybe a good starting point is YouTube filters, according to Keller, which is also according to YouTube, it's public knowledge, you can look this up, 1 billion pieces of content. Was it a year or daily?
It was last quarter.
1 quarter?
It was 1 quarter, 1 billion comments on one platform, sort of one company.
I think I read recently that YouTube took down over 1 billion comments last quarter. So that's just YouTube, just comments, just 1 quarter.
Which is interesting for in one regard, because when I think about content moderation, I don't think about the comments,
Right. I mean, I guess for YouTube, there's not beyond videos and comments, like that's about it that you would be concerned with.
Yeah.
On Facebook, there's probably 1 billion different kinds of things. Events, like we had fake events during the 2016 election, of course, that brought opposite sides together. And then you have all these other forms of interaction. So I guess the more complicated your platform is, the harder it is to moderate, or the more kinds of content that you would have to watch over and have people who are somewhat experts on. But I think this touches on a broader point, which is our conversation with Keller was about a very unprecedented problem, which is that we have huge platforms that pool a bunch of information from millions and millions of people. Almost every American is somehow involved in these platforms, and their speech is there. The information they receive is there. And yet there is no way, technically or from a policy perspective, to actually moderate that content and make sure that all that content is legal, that content doesn't violate people's copyrights, that it doesn't defame people, that it isn't just dangerous misinformation that we deem as a society to be bad for us, like Russian disinformation during an election.
And the reason for that comes back to what the platforms originally were intended to be, which is they're not held to the same media standards because they weren't supposed to be media.
Right.
But
No,
they are.
They very much are. If anything, even if we classify them as not media depends on them for their lifeblood.
Well, okay, because my take on content moderation has become much more sympathetic to these platforms, given, I took Keller's class, and, the perspective of it is not easy to give people a platform they're looking for when everyone wants a different platform. And at the same time, everyone's almost dependent on these platforms. She was talking about, how Facebook made that one move to get rid of news because they didn't want to be news. They didn't want to be news. Yeah. And then that fundamentally affected the bottom lines of all these news platforms.
Probably about the same time that YouTube was cranking up the news component of what they showed users, Facebook was cranking it down because there was all this criticism after the 2016 election about political content and fake news being presented to users. And Facebook, at least this was their public messaging, that, they could have had other reasons, but Facebook said, okay, we're going to dial down how much news people see, even if it's friends and family sharing it, and dial up how much content is just regular friends and, baby pictures, friends and family content. And for news publications that depended on Facebook for traffic, that was a huge problem. They had reshaped their business models and their website technical implementation and so forth, independence on Facebook, bringing them traffic. And now suddenly that changed. So yeah, you can't serve all of those functions at once, and whichever one you pick can have real downsides.
I remember having a debate with some of my classmates about, what if this is the best that these platforms can look like? And Jess, you had Keller talk about this one quote that she had on her Twitter account.
I sort of was stalking you online before this interview. And I found your Twitter account, and you have this great tweet that you have pinned. And if you don't mind, I would like to read it, and I would like you to explain what it means. You say, "We imagine that platforms can bring the whole sprawling chaos of human behavior into compliance with the law, make our lives policeable and policed to a degree no government in history could have imagined. Not only do we seem to think it's possible, we think it's a good idea." And then in your comments, you say, "I'm using the first person plural in confusing ways. When I say we, I don't mean you, and some of the time I don't mean me." So I just want to know, what?
Well, first of all, the you there is a particular person. It's Mike Godwin, the coiner of Godwin's law, which is about the probability of any internet conversation turning into accusations of Nazism as, time goes on. So I wasn't trying to put words in Mike Godwin's mouth specifically. But I think there is a collective sense right now that all of this misbehavior on the internet can be policed, if only platforms would do the right thing. And I think in a way that reflects our failure to grapple with just how different human communication is now that the internet has arrived. Things that we would once have muttered to a friend in a bar or heard in a sermon in a church or passed as a written note to our friends in grade school, all those things now are digital and they're sitting on a privately owned server somewhere. And so, the ephemeral becomes permanent and the local becomes global and things
West
that are
Elm
constrained.
Caleb.
What's that?
West Elm Caleb is this TikTok trend of some girl who got ghosted by a guy. And now West Elm Caleb's Hinge account is a global phenomenon that companies are jumping in on to advertise the fact that they're not West Elm Caleb.
See, this is like a perfect internet thing. I don't even know who West Elm Caleb is, but I know that people have very strong opinions about it.
Strong, very strong.
Yeah, but, because these things are now policeable, they're sitting on servers, we can check them all. And by the way, because the servers are owned by private companies and they're not constrained by the First Amendment, so they can censor in ways that governments can't, and they're not constrained by the Fourth Amendment, so they can surveil in ways that governments can't. That just opens all kinds of doors toward regulating human speech and behavior in ways nobody ever conceived of before. And, COVID has pushed us even further in that direction because now everything we do is online. There's less and less space outside the regulable world of the internet. So, I think it's early days. I think we have not worked through how governance should work and how human rights or constitutional rights should work in this new framework.
And this is what gets at the debate I was having with my classmates. A lot of these issues are not really content moderation issues. I mean, they come through in content moderation, but people are putting this out there. People are saying this. People are spreading this. And people are spreading this for a reason that has nothing to do with technology. They're spreading this for reasons that have to do with their identity, that have to do with their economic situations, and that just have to do with being a human, and which is being, susceptible to lies. It's being susceptible to narratives. It's being motivated and driven with maybe not necessarily the most pure intentions. And we're looking at these platforms often as the ones who should and must make everyone live in the society that we view as perfect.
Yeah, and in terms of people being gullible or liking to gossip. Like the question is whether platforms think that's an asset or a liability. And I think that Keller's point is like, it depends on the time, like it depends on the timeline, because specifically at the time that Facebook decided it was a legal liability, that's when YouTube decided that it was like their moral responsibility to start like carrying news content.
And this is a very important question, but it's also a legal question that's been tested in court, which is, what do we do and how do we feel about amplification? It's true that disinformation, people have lied since people have talked. And, and people have tried to fool or deceive or just at least use and leverage the control of information to influence the behavior
Santa
of others.
Claus.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Anna
clearly...
Delvey. For anybody that just watched the Anna Delvey Netflix docuseries that defend the public defender, his closing statement said there's a little bit of Anna Delvey in all of us. We all lie all the time.
Very wise. Very wise. I mean, like, obviously Santa Claus, that's like a total myth.
I just wanted, before we get into this, trigger warning for all of our listeners.
Yeah.
If you're below the age of like 7.
Yeah, if you're below the age of 7, just we're just joking.
If you're older than 7 and you don't know,
yeah. Well, then do we have some news for you. But more to the point is, yes, people have been lying and trying to use information as a tool for power all the time. But how do we feel about those kinds of messages, and also our kind of frail psychology that's vulnerable to these messages? How do we feel when suddenly we multiply that by 1 million? How do we feel when suddenly we ensure that those messages will never be forgotten, and that they will always spread, and that they'll spread particularly based on certain psychological tendencies that are unique to individuals? And that, I mean, has been argued in court. There was a case called Gonzalez versus Google, where they argued that, yes, ISIS was the one who propagated terroristic messages, radicalizing content on Facebook and Google. But there's something to the amplification, to the multiplication of this of this information power that actually makes the platforms something more like a creator rather than a publisher. And that, of course, is the legal dispute. Is like Section 230, immunized publishing of this kind of content, because it's that a publisher shouldn't be treated as a creator. But what happens when you're actually a creator? And what happens when we think that amplification is a form of creation?
The third pillar of U.S. Platform speech regulation is CDA 230. And it, in a way, you can think of it as responding to that problem, saying we don't want to have platforms just take things down anytime there's an accusation. But also the people who drafted it, now Senator Wyden and then Senator Cox, were quite explicit then, and they keep saying it now, they're both still around and talking about this, that they also wanted to have platforms free to do content moderation, free to set their own rules and enforce them and not worry that they were going to get in trouble. And sort of to achieve that, they both put in a provision saying platforms are immune when they take down speech. You can't sue them for taking down your speech. But also, platforms are not liable for illegal content that their users post if it violates things like defamation law. It still doesn't create an immunity for the federal criminal law or copyright, those other things we talked about. And the reasoning behind that second part is there had been a pair of cases where one platform that held itself out as just an open, neutral place where anyone could come talk, they were sued for defamation, and the court said, no, I don't think you're liable because you weren't the editor of this speech. And another platform that held itself out as family friendly and said, we're going to enforce some rules, got sued. And the court said, oh, you look like an editor to me. I am going to hold you liable because you were undertaking to look at and, try to cull out bad content on your platform. And Congress really, they didn't like that set of incentives. They wanted to create immunities that would make it possible for platforms to go out and do content moderation, but also make it possible for them to take a very pro-free expression approach and leave things up if they wanted to. Now, this, of course, was passed in a context of much less consolidation. I don't think anyone expected that so much of the world's speech would be mediated by a very, very small number of companies back when this law was passed.
And as Keller pointed out, I mean, Congress's protections for these content moderators as such and not as editors, that came before really the realization of how consolidated the digital marketplace was.
That's right. I mean, maybe Wyden and Cox, the creators of 230, they would really maybe, although they still defend it to this day, maybe they think again if they could somehow back in the 1990s see into the future and realize, wait a minute, all of our information is really going to be controlled by about 3 different platforms, 3 or 4, roughly, depending on your function. And everyone is going to be on it.
When we started this podcast, we were concerned with the fact that we're entering a whole new world of new tools that we don't really understand. We still don't really understand them. Like, we're still learning what is Twitter and what is its utility. We're still learning what is YouTube and what is its utility. And we just don't know. And we're kind of like doing it as we go. And, you know, in some respects, it's kind of admirable that we even had these efforts of these forward-looking laws coming into effect. Mm-hmm. I've just been thinking about the whole context politically in addressing these things. Mm-hmm. Everyone has these motives, and if we're looking at America, we are not passing anything. We're not going to pass anything. We're not going to address anything. We're just going to fight about it to whip up a coalition to get people in the office to maybe do something, probably do nothing. Mm-hmm. And then you look at Europe in general, the Council of Europe, the European Union. Mm-hmm. They're so productive in learning and analyzing and really nailing down what is the actual problem here. You know, like, as Keller said, it's a shot in the dark. We are oftentimes regulating things that we don't really know about. We don't really understand what their impacts are on people. Mm-hmm. We don't really understand how they affect our thinking, how they affect our habits, how they affect our psychologies.
You know, in the wake of the 2016 election, a bunch of funding flowed into researching online disinformation. So a lot of people have been trying to answer questions like that. And a number of them are my colleagues at the Cyber Policy Center, particularly at the Stanford Internet Observatory. There's a lot of empirical research going on about both how disinformation flows, but also there's a lot of research about, you know, how it affects people, you know, who is actually sharing it. Turns out that correlates to age quite a bit. Who is believing what it says? It turns out plenty of people like to share it as a signifier of tribal identity, kind of, rather than because they specifically believe it's true. And so I don't have my head around the whole body of that research. And I think some of it conflicts, and I'm sure that, you know, studies conflict with each other, and there's a lot more to learn. But I do think these foundational empirical questions about, is this harm we're talking about, is it real? How does it happen? What are the mechanics? What are the interventions? Is absolutely the right place to start.
And I don't know. It's
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting political point there,
right?
Which actually August brought up to me the other day when I was asking him for help on one of my papers.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, Jess?
No,
Okay, well, I mean, I was saying, I was just making the point, and this is something I think Carl would agree with too, but is that the United States has conflicting interests when it comes to regulating platforms, because these are American companies, you know, and it was because of 230, and it was released at the time that it was, you know, in the 90s, before we could see the full implications of the internet. And it was one of the first internet laws. And frankly, the rest of the world eventually largely followed suit, because it's pretty much impossible to have platforms in your in your economy, but also hold them liable for everything that is on the platform. You know, there is a conflict of interest where you'll see a lot from executives at Google and other big tech companies that you can't break up big tech, specifically the big platforms, because it's a national security issue, because it's an economic security issue, because these are national champions that not only bring more benefits than harms to the American public, but are serious leverage and advantage for the United States on the global stage.
I mean, look at Obama administration.
Yes, that was
before we knew anything about these companies.
Right, you know, people were only beginning to wake up at the end of the Obama administration,
which was the 2016 election.
Which was the 2016 election, which was Cambridge Analytica, and you know that's. But really, no administration in recent memory has been cozier with big tech than the Obama administration. So Europe, on the other hand, doesn't have these national champions. They don't have these tech companies. Frankly, they didn't succeed in cultivating an early Silicon Valley like we did. There are probably a million different reasons for that. But one of them is stricter IP laws. The other is, they didn't have 230 when we did. And so we have actually probably a lot to thank for 230. I mean, this is tricky because like when you think about something like, sexually, sexual abuse, sexual abuse content online, which is, depending on how you look at it, it does seem to be pretty common on forums like Reddit or even like Tumblr and Craigslist. And then there are whole separate sites devoted to just promoting child sexual abuse material, or CSAM. And so it seems like pretty obvious to us as like citizens. And this was after the 2016 election too, was like, just ban it. Like don't let that kind of content, or like misinformation, Russian, robotic disinformation, just ban it. Just don't allow it. And like once you have those penalties, the platforms will comply. And that makes a lot of, on its face, a lot of common sense, which is why this is tricky. Because, there's a lot of like political action to modify Section 230, which is that liability shield. But every single time that we've done that, it has utterly failed. It is on the one hand shut down websites, that chilling effect that we talked about with Keller, and on the other hand, it has led to content moderation policies that we still are not content with, and yet still bad information that we dislike gets through the filters. So it's just a technical problem. We talked about like maybe AI could help with this, but there are problems there that connect with our conversation with Daimler about like how AI itself has problems, behaving consistently, fairly, and transparently.
And this honestly goes back also to what you were saying about you have to define like what these platforms are doing in order to put them in a box and put them hold them legally liable, and to ask the question like, what is Facebook doing? Like now that's a different question. Like what is Meta doing? Like that's a totally different company. And like what is Twitter? That could potentially change based on the fact that Elon Musk is now the majority shareholder. They are literally designed to be so fluid that they can just adjust to the marketplace and like become what they need to be, maybe to not be held liable to the same standards as other traditional corporations.
There's such an interesting element to this, which is, what are the platform's goals? What are they trying to be for their users? And if your web search, the goal is to show people what they were looking for. And so, in theory, that would mean showing everything that's legal and trying to show that, that first 10 results, enough of a diversity of results so that if somebody who searched for Nike was really looking to buy shoes on the one hand or look for criticism of their labor practices on the other, both of those users will find something relevant. But even web search has sort of moved into taking some things down, such as non-consensual sexual images voluntarily over the years.
Can I ask one question? Because, this is kind of making me think content moderation itself is kind of equally as undefined as AI. When we're talking about content moderation, what are we actually talking about? Because we're clearly not upset about most content moderation. Most content moderation is terrorist content, child pornography, sexual abuse. So, but yet it still has this incredibly, tough political, social and cultural dimension to it that gets everyone riled up. I think myself, August in his books.
Don't mind me.
I think, for me personally, I brought this up in the interview, but my first blush of my understanding of content moderation was on gay Twitter. All these content creators who are quite radical, quite, oftentimes speaking truth to power, in my perception, they were frequently barred and taken offline. And there was this perception that this was targeted. And, Kelly even acknowledged there's some research out there that there is a disproportionate enforcement of these policies. And then even more currently on TikTok, and we'll talk to Lip Gloss, content creator on TikTok, where there's a ton of Black women who are content creators who have the same kind of, social justice or cultural justice angle. And there's a big sweep of their content. Meanwhile, there's other accounts of equal or greater size that seem to be clear violation of these policies. So, and that's not content moderation per se. That's discrimination, actually. It's censorship, actually.
I tend to think of it in the sense, like, if you're going to hold someone legally liable for something, I think, especially if it's going to be something they, like, should have reasonably anticipated, it needs to extend naturally from, like, legal sources they can understand. So I think, like, First Amendment speech is restricted when it's dangerous, right? Like, when it poses a threat. And that even extends, like, beyond American borders. Like, I think very recently there was this case in the UK where a man was sentenced to, like, a certain number of community service hours because of, like, a very offensive tweet. Which he actually, like, his defense counsel said, like, oh, he erased it after 20 minutes. So, like, what are we even talking about here? Because it doesn't exist anymore. But, like, the tweet itself, I think, called for, like, violence against some, like, former military member. But the idea being, like, look, this posed a threat to someone. And so, in a sense, you're liable for that. So, like, content moderation for me, I think, starts and encompasses calls to action, maybe, like, dangerous information, I guess, like, information that poses a dangerous threat or, like, calls for danger. But if it's just, like, an opinion, I kind of feel like in the marketplace of ideas, it has, like, even if you don't like the opinion, and I might, like, maybe I wouldn't like the opinion, I just feel like it deserves to be that, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think
it gets to be there legally under the First Amendment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a very strong argument. I mean, I guess 2 points here. One, what we view as content that should be illegal changes. You know, we used to have crimes of moral turpitude, where things that you said that, frankly, you were just offended, you know, white, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon people.
It's funny the contradictions in American history. We're like, First Amendment, but our history is quite complex.
And, like, obviously, you know, we've always had laws regulating what you can say or show about sex. Sexual abuse, obviously, is still illegal. But, you know, that also has changed a lot in the past, where, like, people thought, like, oh, this is offensive and gross, but it was just porn, you know, and, you know, it's this. And so this leads me to the second point, which is, I just want to answer this question by bringing up a case. It was a case called Smith. And this case predated 230. It was about a very old man, immigrant, I believe, from Poland, who ran a bookstore. And that bookstore eventually ended up selling a book that was deemed to violate one of these crimes of moral turpitude, essentially, to be incredibly inappropriate, lewd, and, as an aside, poorly written. And you know, this case ultimately went up to the Supreme Court because it was a big question. Eleazar Smith didn't obviously read every single book in his bookstore. That would be impossible. He didn't have enough life left to read all those books. And all his job was to buy books from distributors and sell them. So why should he be held responsible for selling those kinds of things? Same thing with the clerk that actually sold the book. He's not reading this book before he sells it to you. And, you know,
and people want the books.
Right.
And people wrote the books.
Yeah, people wrote the books, you know, so there's obviously a First Amendment argument there. But moreover, it just seems unfair, you know, to hold him liable. And, you know, Potter Stewart, who also wrote in another case called Jacobellis, that when it comes to pornography, I know it when I see it. You know,
classic quote.
Comes
up
classic,
more than you would think.
Yeah, very classic quote. One that you can honestly imagine, you know, someone on the Supreme Court today applying that again to this very same issue. Yeah. But you know, but he actually wrote here that what's more important is that the person should have known in some way that the thing is wrong. That the knowledge is more important, regardless of what is wrong or what is right, because that changes over time. But whatever that happens to be at a particular time, your scienter, or your knowledge, is the critical thing when it comes to imposing liability. And because Eleazar Smith didn't even know, was completely an innocent man, you know, that he was vindicated. And so that's, I guess, how I would answer what is condom moderation. It is when people knowingly, at least defined under the law today, when people knowingly promote or allow content that they know is.
I have to think that, like, these online platforms that at least serve as social medias, they have to know, because, like, in their perfect world, their platform is just an extension of everyday life. And they recognize that this happens in everyday life.
Right.
And so,
the law should follow.
And so for them, it's like, this is a public forum. Yeah. There aren't rules for public forums, like, to that extent.
It's kind of interesting that we just immediately go to a legal solution.
Yeah. Well, you know, law school.
Here we are. And it's kind of, to Keller's point about, we're looking for these platforms to make everyone law-abiding citizens. But I think it's even further than that. We're looking for the law to make people good people. And I think even here, we need to, like, content moderation and discourse online, we need to really be thinking, I think, more expansively than what is our actual goal? Is our goal to limit racism and limit these harms in society that get perpetuated through our speech? Let's discuss hate speech and who are the people who speak hatefully, why, and what in what ways makes that more amplified and more online, but also in what ways makes that more amplified just in general. Because we're in an era where there's evidence of more hate in general, and there's also more inequality. There's also more homelessness. There's also more poverty. And I don't think if we're being genuinely concerned about these issues, we're going to look so much more broader than platforms. Like it seems disingenuous to me to put this in a small little narrow understanding of this is a platform problem and platforms and I think this makes even the transparency that we were talking about more important, because we really don't know how much platforms and content and this new digital ecosystem are responsible for anything.
No,
we have no clue.
It's a societal problem, and like the magic of the internet is that it brings together people that never would have met based on certain interests, and like that's a good thing and that's a bad thing.
I know that like when we talked to Keller, when I asked her about like how do we know that the 2016 election was influenced by Russian disinformation? Can anyone prove that definitively? Can anyone say that like a sizable portion of voters were persuaded by that factor alone? It's impossible.
Did they fill out a survey?
Yeah, but at the same time, I will say that there is a correlation, that like as soon as we started to move on to these platforms and share information on these platforms, particularly political information, suddenly we started to get all these very strange effects, populist effects. I will say also though that, like turning to the law, which is inherently a narrow conversation, is also will automatically limit you to sticks rather than carrots, like punish rather than reward different kinds of behavior.
Although we know how, like UI, UX.
Wait, what?
UI, like user interface, user experience,
yeah,
rewards, dopamine levels, like being online.
Yes,
sharing,
that's true. That's absolutely true.
Interacting.
And so that's more like a corporate platform policies. How are they influencing our behaviors on that level, which doesn't have to do with the state, at least yet. But that's but also like with this conversation, we're not talking about the actual people who, for example, are posting child pornography.
Exactly. Exactly. That's like my whole thing. Like when I was having this debate a few months ago with our classmates, are we really addressing the right correlation? And like, why do people get dopamine from this content? I don't get any dopamine from hateful content, but some people do. Why? And that's like, it seems like a question we're not really even concerned about addressing here. Like it seems like we're all, back to my conspiracy theories, it seems like we're all just totally okay with like the fundamentally like bankrupt inability to talk across and empathize with each other, and instead of doing the hard work, because it's much harder.
Well, I think people okay with it, or do they just accept it as a necessary part of being online? And I think like we've been wanting to talk about like people that are like they choose to be offline, and those are the people that aren't okay with it and don't accept it as like a rule of the game that they want to play.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's kind of a background assumption when we talk about regulating platforms, that platforms have kind of just opened a window to what is basically human nature. That really we've always been this.
Which people hate. People hate when I say that.
It's like an additional plane, like without gravity.
Yeah, it's like had these platforms or something akin to it. Some kind of mass printing press that printed everyone's opinions back in like the 16th century. We would have seen the same kind of disinformation. Maybe, I don't know, but I think that's the background assumption. I'm not sure if that's actually true. I think that platforms are influencing our behaviors in novel ways. I think that there are other, like, for example, economic disparities that are influencing people's behavior and also just how they communicate. So we're just dealing with a very complex system. And I think that in general, when we limit our conversation to platforms, it's like out of practicality. Because it's like, how do we start to like socially re-engineer people?
Well, I even want to push back on that, because I don't think it's really that like I really think it's that like impractical. Like I'm thinking about, we know empirically that hate crimes are less when everyone can afford their bills. And there are things we can definitely do within our body politic right now that help people pay their bills. Yeah. We can cancel student loans. Mm-hmm. We can do more for healthcare. Mm-hmm. We can do more for minimum wages. Mm-hmm. We can do more for opportunity. We can have UBI. We can do all these things in so many ways. But I'm going to get even more conspiratorial.
Let's go there.
We have two parties that are really concerned about Section 230 that have the power to actually address some of the broader social issues that we know empirically, without having to open up Facebook, without having to open up Twitter, limits these types of social ills. So why are we not more so spending our energy talking about anything other than Section 230?
I mean, this is where research will come into play, which is like, how does economic hardship affect what you believe and what you're willing to believe and how you think and how you reason?
And how do campaign finance laws and the lack thereof inform our inability to regulate big tech?
Yes. Yeah, it's all these things are connected. Yeah. Everything is connected as like a high.
Which is the point of this podcast.
But this is a difficult question. I think there are two camps. One, if we reform the platforms, we can suddenly change the behavior of society because we've become so dependent on them for information. On the other hand, two, platforms will always be the same unless we change the behavior of society. And really, it's not a causal thing. So I think that's a debate.
For a later date. We've actually got a coffee date.
We do have a coffee date, which our audience will hear about soon.
Exactly. So anyway, I'm really glad we had this conversation just because to me, it just feels like we're focusing on symptoms and not fundamental problems. And if we're only focusing on symptoms, then we'll have a lot of work for lawyers, which is good for us, but I don't think we'll ever really solve anything to leave this on an optimistic note. Anyway.
Sometimes you don't know something's a problem, though, unless it has enough symptoms.
It's true.
Yeah, and sometimes symptoms are actually the problem.
Wait, when?
Maybe it's the platforms that are changing human
It's
nature.
true, we just don't know.
Anyway,
perhaps. Thank you all yet again for tuning in to The Periphery. Hopefully this has inspired you all to get involved, join the conversation. And if you felt so inspired, leave us a question to our email at theperipherypodcast@gmail.com. Join our Patreon, support our work. We want to do so much more than we do right now. Follow us on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, The Periphery Podcast, basically everywhere. And we will, as always, see you next week.
Please talk to us.
Catch us on all those platforms.
Yes.